What if the deepest secret of our past was never lost, only hidden in plain sight? What if the true timeline of humanity stretches not across civilizations, but across 241 millennia of forgotten ages, buried and rewritten again and again? There is a story so old that even myth avoids speaking it, a story preserved not in books or monuments, but in a single silent artifact, a fragment of clay whose symbols defy every chronology we were taught to trust. It hints at eras erased, at rulers unnamed, and at a world that ended long before ours began. Someone tried to cover its truth beneath sand and silence. Someone hoped we would never find it. But the earth has a long memory, and tonight it opens one of its oldest doors. Before we step through it, take a moment to let your breath slow. Let the darkness around you soften. This is a quiet journey, meant to be taken gently. And if these stories help you rest, you're welcome to like and subscribe, but only if it feels right. Now tell me, from which corner of the night are you listening, and what hour has your sky chosen? Our path begins in a forgotten cradle of the ancient world, where ruins sleep beneath warm winds, and where fragments of a story they tried to erase still whisper through the dust. Chapter 1: The Mystery of the King List. The night is quiet now. Let your shoulders soften a little, and let your breath settle into a slow, gentle rhythm. As you listen, imagine the world fading into a soft, warm darkness. In that quiet, a single object comes into focus, a small tablet of clay, no bigger than your hand, darkened by age, its surface crossed by tiny wedge-shaped marks. It lies in the dust of what is now southern Iraq, waiting for someone to pick it up and read a secret it should not contain. The people who made that tablet called themselves the Sumerians. They appeared in history almost like an afterthought, or like a memory suddenly returning. No slow climb from caves, no simple huts learning to be cities. From the moment we first meet them, they already have writing, laws, irrigation canals, temples, and priests who watch the stars. For archaeologists, that suddenly is uncomfortable. For storytellers, it feels like a page turned in the middle of a book whose first chapters are missing. One day in the ruins of those old cities, places with names like Nippur, Larsa, and ancient Uruk, someone uncovered that small clay tablet. At first glance, it looked like many others, cuneiform script neatly arranged in lines, the calm handwriting of a trained scribe. But instead of grain accounts or temple inventories, the text was something stranger. It was a list. A list of kings and of how long each one had ruled. A simple idea met with a very complicated problem. The names themselves sound like distant thunder: Alulim, Alalgar, Enmen-Luana, Enmen-Gal-Ana, Dumuzi the shepherd. Each king is tied to a single city: Eridu, Bad-Tibira, Larak, places that feel half myth, half map. Beside each name, the scribe carefully pressed numbers into clay, and this is where the world tilts, because those numbers are not years as we know them. One king rules for 28,800 years, another for 36,000, another for 43,200. Add them all together, and the total is said to be 241,200 years of rule before something the text simply calls the flood. For a modern mind, used to lifetimes that fit in less than a century, it sounds almost comical. Surely, we say, this must be exaggeration. Surely it is poetry or symbolism or a mistake. Historians at first waved it away just like that. Mythological kings, they called them. Divine figures, not real rulers. The numbers, they said, must stand for something else: star cycles, dynasties, or sacred numerology. Anything, really, except what is written plainly on the clay. It was easier to smile and move on than to sit with the unease those years create. But the tablet doesn't stop with the impossible. After the flood, the tone shifts. The same calm hand continues the list with new names: kings of cities we can actually dig up, rulers whose monuments we can still visit in fragments. The reigns contract. Hundreds of years, then tens, then lengths that fit comfortably into human generations. Now the tablet lines up with other records, with inscriptions on city walls, with burials in royal tombs. Before the flood, Time is unreal. After the flood, it becomes measurable. The clay does not mark where myth ends and history begins. It simply flows from one into the other without apology. That seamless transition is what unsettles scholars the most. If the whole thing were fantasy, it would be easy to file away under myth. If the whole thing were strictly historical, it would fit neatly into textbooks. But here, on one small tablet, both worlds sit together. Impossible spans of ages followed by kings we can verify. It is as if someone took a dream and a chronicle and pressed them into the same piece of clay, asking future readers to decide how much they were willing to believe, or how much they were willing to ignore. To the Sumerians, numbers were not casual. They used a base 60 system that still shapes our minutes and seconds. They counted with an elegance that allowed huge magnitudes to be expressed with simple units. When they wrote that a king ruled for so many tens of thousands of years, they weren't just scribbling for drama. The totals fall into patterns, multiples of sacred units, neat blocks of time that echo the cycles they saw in the sky. For them, these were not wild guesses. They were part of a carefully ordered vision of the universe, where rule, time, and the stars shared the same language. Modern scholars sitting under fluorescent lights far away from the desert heat have proposed many explanations. Some say the kings before the flood might stand for whole dynasties, compressed into single names. Others think they represent ages, long cosmic seasons the Sumerians turned into stories about rulers, so people could remember them. A few more quietly suggest another possibility, that the scribes were writing down something they truly believed, something inherited from a time already half lost even to them. Not a fairy tale, but a memory stretched out of shape by distance. And somewhere in between all those theories, there is a faint sense of taboo. The list is copied and recopied through centuries, from Sumer to Babylon to Assyria. Some versions shorten the reigns a little, some add or remove names, some highlight certain cities over others. Yet no one ever deletes the idea itself. The antediluvian kings remain. Their immense lifespans stay on the page quietly defiant. The polite thing in academic circles is to discuss them with a small shrug. The honest thing is to admit that they don't fit our understanding of history at all. For the Sumerians, the real boundary was not between real and unreal, but between before the flood and after the flood. Everything on the far side of that watery line belongs to a world where the rules were different, where kings might be closer to gods, and time might move more slowly like thick honey. Everything on this side is our world, shorter lives, fragile cities, memories that fade. The King List doesn't try to convince anyone. It simply lays this structure down like a quiet map and leaves it for whoever reads it to wrestle with. As you lie there breathing softly, you can picture that tablet now, resting in the dim light of a museum or in the palm of a dusty archaeologist's hand. Tiny marks on fired clay, carrying a story that stretches hundreds of thousands of years and yet fits within a single breath. 8 kings before the flood, and then the world we know. Between those two parts runs the central mystery of our tale, a mystery so old that many would rather pretend it isn't there at all. In the chapters to come, we'll wander a little deeper into that mystery. We'll walk through the cities that first received kingship from heaven, stand at the edge of the flood that divides eternity from history, and listen to what the clay may still be trying to say. For now, let your mind rest on that simple image, a list of names, a cascade of impossible years, and a civilization that calmly wrote them down, as if they were merely facts. And let the question linger softly in the dark with you. What kind of world must exist for such a list to feel true? Chapter 2. The Divine Calendar of the Sumerians. Before we go any further, take another slow breath. Let the room around you soften as if the edges of things are losing their sharpness. In the hush behind your thoughts, imagine sitting beside a low clay table in a Sumerian school. The air smells faintly of oil lamps and baked earth. A young scribe in training leans over a wet tablet, stylus in hand, learning not just to write words, but to write time. For the Sumerians, numbers were never just numbers. They were shapes of the world, quiet reflections of something larger. We count in tens, using the fingers on our hands. They chose another path. Their mathematics was built on 60. 60 simple marks could unfold into huge magnitudes with surprising grace. To them, 60 wasn't just convenient. It was almost dignified, whole. A number that felt worthy of gods and kings. You still live inside that choice even now. When you glance at a clock and see 60 minutes in an hour, or think of a circle as 360 degrees, you're touching the ghost of Sumerian math. They divided the sky, the day, and even long ages using this sexagesimal system. It let them cut time into fine slices, and also stack those slices into towering spans. With base 60, the same simple units could describe a moment of star rise or an age of rule. The difference was only in how many layers you added. To the scribes, those layers weren't random. Certain combinations of 60 had flavor, meaning multiples like 3,600, 60 times 60, became a great unit of counting. Go higher, and you reach 216,000, 432,000. Numbers that appear in myths, in king lists, in the lengths of reigns that look impossible to us. When a Sumerian scribe wrote that a king ruled for X sars and ners, great units of 60 piled on 60, it wasn't casual exaggeration. It was a way of saying, this reign belongs to the deep cycles, to the big clock, not the small one. Time for them moved in circles more than straight lines. The river flooded and withdrew. Planets rose in patterns that repeated, slow and dignified. Eclipses came back on schedule, like secret appointments heaven kept with itself. The Sumerians watched all this with careful eyes and steady hands, recording the rhythms in clay. A year wasn't just a trip around the sun. It was part of a larger loop, which itself sat inside another. The cosmos was like a set of nested wheels, turning within wheels, all ticking softly according to a divine design. So when we read about a king ruling for 28,800 years, we imagine someone impossibly old, wandering palace halls with a beard like a waterfall. But a Sumerian scribe might have seen something else. Those huge reigns could be shorthand for cycles, astronomical patterns expressed as royal ages. A king might stand in for a whole era, a long turning of the sky. The transfer of kingship from one city to another might mirror a shift in the heavens, a new star rising in importance, a planet entering a different segment of the zodiac. To us, it is biography. To them, it might have been cosmology in disguise. In that light, the king list starts to look less like a strange fantasy and more like a kind of calendar. Not the small calendar you hang on a wall to remember birthdays. A divine calendar, mapping the great periods of earth and sky using the language people understood best, the language of rulers and cities. Each king before the flood becomes like a chapter heading in the story of the universe. Each enormous reign is a cycle, a season of the cosmos written with a crown instead of a star. And yet it's important to notice something gentle here. The Sumerians didn't sit down and label it symbolic. They didn't add a footnote saying, we're talking in metaphors now. For them, the line between a person and a pattern was thin. A god could be a star and a personality at the same time. A king could be a human ruler and a vessel for a cosmic age. Their world didn't divide literal and symbolic the way ours does. Both could exist together, layered like impressions on clay. The sacredness of 60 fed into this. In their pantheon, the highest gods were often associated with numerical values. The chief deity could be marked by the number 60, others by 50, 40, 30. Numbers became a quiet code for rank and role. When such a culture tells you that someone ruled for 36,000 years, they may be weaving a tapestry, part honor, part cosmology, part memory. The number is doing more work than one meaning alone can hold. It is praising, encoding, and measuring all at once. Picture that young student scribe again, eyes narrowed in concentration. The teacher dictates, after the kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu. The stylus moves, name, city, reign. But behind the memorized phrases lies a deeper truth the student may only dimly sense, that he is copying a map of time itself. He is helping to keep the gears of a divine clock in motion, not by turning them, but by remembering where each tooth belongs. In a world where forgetting was the real danger, writing was a sacred defense. When later scholars look at the King List, they mostly see a problem to solve. How do we make these numbers reasonable, they ask. How do we strip away the myth and find the real years underneath? But from a Sumerian perspective, that might sound a bit backwards. The myth and the math are not extra decorations, they are the point. The list isn't only trying to tell you who ruled when. It is whispering about how time itself flows, in great waves and small ripples, all marked in careful strokes of 60. As your breathing stays slow and steady, you can let that idea rest beside you. The enormous reigns of the pre-flood kings may not be clumsy mistakes, but elegant hints, numbers pointing to cycles in the heavens, to patterns too large to see from a single lifetime. Our minds, like straight timelines, start here and there. Theirs like spirals, returns, seasons that come back dressed in slightly different clothes. In the soft dark behind your eyelids, you might imagine time not as a road, but as a set of circles, some small, some vast. In the center, the life of a single person. Around it, the life of a city. Around that, the dance of planets and stars. The Sumerian divine calendar tried to hold all of these together, assigning each circle its king, its name, its number, in base 60. And somewhere at the edge of those circles sit the kings before the flood. Their reigns so vast that they can only really be understood as cycles of the sky. In the next part of our journey, we'll move from these quiet calculations to the drama that divides their world in two, the Great Flood itself. We'll see how that watery boundary turns the divine calendar, resets the clock, and ushers in the shorter, more familiar reigns of human kings. For now, let the image linger gently. A clay tablet, lines of careful numbers in base 60, and a people who believed that by writing them down, they were keeping time with the heartbeat of the cosmos itself. Chapter 3: The Flood as a Divine Divide. Let yourself sink a little deeper into the quiet. Imagine the desert night over ancient Shuruppak, a city that once sat near the looping bends of the Euphrates. The stars above are cold and clear. Beneath those stars, people sleep in mud-brick homes, unaware that one day, thousands of years later, strangers will dig through their floors and call it archaeology. When those diggers finally arrive, with brushes, notebooks, and careful patience, they peel away layers of time like pages in a buried book. There are broken pots, fallen walls, old hearths where families once cooked, and then suddenly, something different. A thick band of clean, water-laid clay and silt, cutting straight across the older city like a quiet scar. Above it, a rebuilt Shuruppak. Below it, a world that will never fully return. That pale layer isn't just dirt, it's evidence. It shows that at some point a massive flood swept over the city, not just a bad rainy season, but a high, powerful surge of river water that tore through streets, collapsed houses, and then slowly withdrew, leaving behind a flat blanket of mud. Similar traces appear at other Mesopotamian sites, Kish, Ur, maybe even parts of Uruk. Not always at the exact same depth, not always with the same force, but enough to suggest that in this low, river-fed land, something truly catastrophic once happened. For the Sumerians, that disaster did not remain just a physical memory. It became a line drawn through time itself. Their stories speak of a flood that nearly erased humankind, sent by divine decision. A single chosen survivor, given warning in a dream, or by a god who quietly disobeyed his peers, builds a boat, shelters life, and rides out the chaos on a churning sea. When the waters recede, he steps onto a cleansed earth. The world on the other side is new and smaller. In the King List, this watery boundary is almost shockingly brief. Then the flood swept over. Just that, one simple statement, like a door suddenly closing. Before that line, 8 kings rule for stretches of time so long they feel almost eternal. After it, the pattern changes. Reigns shrink, names multiply. The kings look less like timeless guardians and more like us, ambitious, fragile, temporary. The flood is not only a natural event, it is a reset of the human story, a divine decision to start the clock over. You can think of it as a fracture in memory. Before the flood, the figures in Sumerian tradition seem almost divine. They are closer to the gods, living in that long, slow rhythm we touched in the last chapter, the great cycles encoded in base 60. Their cities are the first to receive kingship from heaven, the first to learn the arts that make civilization possible. Their lifespans stretch across ages, as if they are made of a slightly different substance than we are. Mortality does not cling to them in quite the same way. After the flood, everything contracts. Lifetimes shorten. Kings die and their deaths matter. Wars begin to leave more visible scars. Instead of enormous mythic spans, we get reigns that can be checked against other records, against monuments, against tombs filled with offerings. The kings are still chosen, still set apart, but they are not remote, shining beings anymore. They are men wrapped in heavy robes, worried about enemies, listening to omens, getting old. The divine and human worlds are still connected, but the bridge is thinner, more fragile. Archaeologists looking at the flood layer in Shurapak and at the myths written centuries later see an echo. They talk about cultural memory, the way a real event can be remembered, retold, reshaped, and eventually turned into sacred story. A devastating regional flood could become over generations the flood, the one that marks before and after for everyone who lives in that land. The King List agrees. It doesn't explain how high the water rose or how long it stayed. It simply treats the flood as the hinge on which history turns. For the people who lived through that remembered age, or whose grandparents told them stories about it, the flood must have felt like the gods rewriting the rules. Fields, houses, streets, even graves would have vanished under the same grey sheet of silt. When they rebuilt, they were not starting from nothing. They still had skills, tools, memories. But there was a sense that an older world had gone under for good. The kings who came after ruled over a landscape haunted by absence. They inherited not only land, but loss. The scribes who copied the King List centuries later were living well after all of this. For them, the flood was already long past, a fixed point in sacred history. Still, every time they wrote that tiny phrase, "Then the flood swept over," they were acknowledging that our story has a break in it, a piece that can't be smoothly joined. On one side, beings whose timescales match the stars. On the other, ordinary kings whose years can be counted on fingers and tallied in clay. Between them lies water and silence. As you breathe gently now, you might imagine yourself standing at the exposed edge of that ancient flood layer. Below your feet, the buried streets of the pre-flood city, the world of the impossibly long-lived kings. Above, the rubble and households of people more like you, living small, complicated lives under the same sun. One terrible surge of water separates them. One line in clay divides their memories. The Sumerians chose to mark that line not just in their soil, but in their very sense of time. In our next step, we'll follow the world after that reset, into the first clearly human kings, the rebuilding of cities, and the quiet way in which a traumatized civilization tried to stitch meaning back together. For now, let the image stay soft in your mind. A band of pale silt in the earth, a single sentence on a tablet, and a flood that turned beings who were almost divine into the brief, bright figures we call mortal. Chapter 4. Global Catastrophes and Shared Memory. By the time the Sumerians were pressing their flood into clay, stories of a great drowning were already beginning to echo in other corners of the world. Not the same names, not the same cities, but the same shape. A world that had gone too far, waters that rose too high, a few survivors clinging to planks, mountains, or the mercy of a god who changed his mind at the last minute. In the lands that would later be called Israel, that memory becomes the story most people know best. Noah, the ark, the pairs of animals, the 40 days of rain. It is told with a moral edge, corruption, judgment, renewal. The details are different from the Sumerian tales. The names have changed, but the backbone is familiar. A warning whispered from a god, a vessel built in time, a family riding over a drowned world, and a promise that things will be different afterward. Far to the east in India, another survivor listens to another warning. In one old tale, a man named Manu rescues a tiny fish who later reveals himself as a god. The fish grows and grows until Manu understands he is dealing with something vast and sacred. The godfish tells him of a coming flood, instructs him to build a boat, to tie it to the horn of the divine fish, and to carry seeds and sages through the waters. Different river, different god. Same pattern, a world washed, a remnant preserved. Across the Mediterranean, Greek storytellers speak of Deucalion and Pyrrha. The gods decide that humankind has become unbearable, noisy, vicious, careless. A flood is sent to wipe the slate clean. Deucalion, warned by his father, builds an ark-like chest. He and Pyrrha float on an endless sea, watching temples and hills disappear under grey water. When the waters drop, they walk on land that feels both old and new. From stones thrown over their shoulders, new people are born. It's myth, yes, but the sense of beginning again is the same. Even across oceans in the Americas, elders sit by fires and tell of a time when the waters rose too high, or when the sky poured out more rain than the earth could bear. In some versions, people escape by climbing the tallest trees or mountains. In others, they ride in canoes, or are turned into animals to survive. The details twist and shift like smoke, but always there is this feeling. Once, long ago, the world nearly ended in water, and our ancestors remember. Modern science, working in its own careful way, looks not at songs but at stone, ice and mud. It finds traces of sudden change, a sharp cooling at the end of the last ice age, a period we now call the Younger Dryas. Temperatures drop again, abruptly. Then, just as abruptly, they rise. Glaciers that had gripped the northern lands begin to melt, releasing oceans of fresh water. Sea levels climb. Coastlines redraw themselves. River systems swell and sometimes fail. Whole valleys may have filled and emptied in violent pulses. For people living near rivers and coasts, it must have felt like the world's foundations had turned to water. Some researchers have suggested that a fragmenting comet or a shower of cosmic debris might have struck the planet around that time, triggering fires, floods, and the sudden cold. Others argue for more gradual causes, shifts in ocean currents, delicate feedback loops in the climate. The debate is still open, still heated in its own academic way. But step back from the arguments, and a simpler picture emerges. The end of the last ice age was not gentle. Our ancestors, scattered across the globe, lived through a time when the sky and sea misbehaved. Imagine being there, not with satellites and forecasts, but with bare eyes and a small, fragile home. Rivers you thought you knew suddenly rise and never really go back to their old beds. Shorelines creep inland, swallowing old fishing spots, old graves, old stories written in the shape of the land. Maybe you move to higher ground. Maybe you watch the horizon where your grandparents once walked, now lost under waves. You don't need exact measurements to feel that the world has shifted under your feet. You only need to remember. And humans are very good at remembering in the only way that really lasts, through story. If your people survived such a time, you might tell your children, once the waters came almost to the sky. Once only a few made it through. You might add a god who warned you, or a mistake that angered the heavens, not to lie but to give shape to the fear and gratitude in your heart. Your children pass that story on. Their children add details, remove others, wrap it in their own names and landscapes. Centuries pass, and what began as memory becomes myth, but the backbone of the flood remains. This is what the video hints at when it lays these stories side by side. Not proof, not a neat equation of this myth equals that event, but the possibility that many cultures are holding on to broken pieces of the same ancient storm. Sumerians speaking of a flood that reset kingship, Hebrews of a flood that cleansed corruption, Indians of a flood guided by a godfish, Greeks of a flood that repopulated the earth with stones. Different costumes, same stage, the planet itself. From the Sumerian point of view, their flood, the one that cuts the king list into before and after, sits in that shadowy zone where geology and myth might overlap. Maybe their ancestors really watched waters pour over their cities, as the mud layers at Shurupak suggest. Maybe they also carried older whispers, traces of even earlier catastrophes at the end of the Ice Age, passed down like a scar in language. By the time scribes pressed tablets in orderly rows, all of these echoes have flowed together into a single sacred event, the flood. As you let these threads weave together in your mind, you can almost picture a vast tapestry stretched around the world. On one side, scientists reading ice cores, counting layers of ash and pollen. On the other, storytellers around fires, speaking of arcs, boats, mountains, and second chances. They are not using the same language. But they might in a quiet way be pointing at the same wound and at the same relief that somehow, in spite of it, we are still here. In the chapters ahead, we'll turn back to Mesopotamia, to the cities that rose in the wake of that remembered deluge, and to the kings who ruled knowing that the gods had once pressed a reset button on the world. For now, you can let one simple idea settle beside you like a soft blanket. Across continents and centuries, human beings kept telling the same kind of story, of a time when water nearly erased everything, and of a few who lived to tell the tale. Chapter 5, Eridu, the First City. Let your breathing slow, Sister Markin, and out. Now picture the very southern edge of ancient Mesopotamia, where the desert once met the sea, and marsh reeds whispered in brackish water. There, long before most cities you've heard of, stood a place the Sumerians remembered with a kind of reverence, Eridu. For them, this wasn't just a town with walls and houses. It was the first city, the place where kingship first descended after the flood. In their stories, Eridu isn't just old, it's foundational. When the gods decided that humanity would have rulers again, that sacred gift of kingship was said to come down from heaven to Eridu first. That simple phrase carries a lot of weight. It suggests that this place didn't grow slowly and randomly out of scattered huts. It arrived almost as a decision. As if the universe had pointed a finger at a spot on the map and said, "Here, start again here." When archaeologists began to dig at the mound now called Tel Abu Shahrain, they found something that seemed to echo the old stories in a quiet, material way. Beneath the sand and broken mud bricks, at the very heart of the site, they unearthed not one temple, but layer upon layer of temples, stacked like pages in a book no one had finished. Roughly 20 phases of rebuilding, one on top of the other, each new sanctuary rising where the old one had stood. Always in the same sacred spot, always reaching up, just a little more. The earliest of those temples were small, simple, almost shy. Modest rooms of packed mud brick with altars and offering tables. Later ones grew larger, more complex, with carefully laid foundations and corners aligned to the cardinal directions. With each reconstruction, the builders seemed to be saying, "This place matters, we are not moving, we are just starting over." Again. In time, all those layers formed a kind of artificial hill, a man-made mountain of devotion, built grain by grain out of the desire to stay anchored to something sacred. To the Sumerians, Eridu was the city of the god Enki, or Ea, as later peoples called him. Enki was a strange, beautiful figure, a lord of fresh water and wisdom, of hidden knowledge and quiet cleverness. His realm was the deep, sweet waters beneath the earth, the source of rivers and life itself. It's not hard to see why survivors of a great flood would cling to a god like that. If water once nearly erased the world, then the god who controls the gentle, life-giving water becomes a bridge between terror and hope. Imagine then a group of survivors after some remembered catastrophe, whether the precise flood we traced in Shurupak or the long, troubled end of the Ice Age. They wander the marshes and empty flats. The old coastal lines are gone. Villages they once knew exist only as stories. At last they choose a spot near reliable springs, near channels they can manage and fish they can catch. They build simple houses. They raise a first small shrine to the god of underground waters and second chances. They probably don't think of themselves as founding the oldest city on Earth. They are just tired, determined people trying to make life start again. But their children remember that this is where things truly restarted. Their grandchildren build a bigger temple on the same spot, honoring the same god who, they are told, helped their ancestors survive the terrible waters. Each rebuilding becomes an act of gratitude and defiance. The flood may have wiped away a world, but it did not wipe away us. So the temple rises, it collapses, it rises again. 20 times more like a heartbeat that refuses to stop. From above, if you could float over time like a quiet bird, you would see Eridu growing slowly outward from that sacred core. Houses cluster around the temple mound, narrow lanes appear, kilns burn, little boats move along the edges of wetlands, carrying fish, reeds, and gossip. Smoke from cooking fires curls into the evening sky. It's not a glittering city of high walls and towers at first. It's a place of mud, reeds, and persistence. Yet in Sumerian memory, this humble sprawl becomes the cradle of post-flood civilization, the place where the new story of humanity truly begins. What makes Eridu so haunting is this feeling that it stands at a hinge between two worlds. Beneath its earliest layers might echo ways of life from the before time, hints of older traditions brought by people whose grandparents still spoke of a different coastline, a different climate. Above, in the later layers, we see the clearer outlines of the Sumerian cities we recognize: organized temples, surpluses, bureaucracy, long-distance trade. Eridu is like a bridge, where memories of a drowned world and plans for a new one meet and clasp hands. The King List quietly reflects this. It names Eridu as the first city to receive kingship, but the list doesn't linger on its human rulers the way it does on later dynasties. Eridu feels almost like a threshold city, half remembered as a holy beginning, half absorbed into myth. The real flesh-and-blood people who farmed its fields and fetched its water rarely show up in the clay we've recovered. Yet the fact that its temple was rebuilt so many times tells us something simple and powerful. Generation after generation refused to abandon that spot. They believed their story anchored there. As your eyes grow heavier, you can imagine yourself walking up that temple mound in one of its later days. The bricks are warm under your bare feet. You carry a small offering, maybe a bowl of grain, maybe a little fish from the marsh. Around you, you can hear the quiet hum of a city that once wasn't there at all. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you know that your ancestors came here from broken places, from flooded valleys and vanished shores. But here, on this height of layered temples, the world feels steady again. In the next chapter, we'll leave Eridu's marshes and follow kingship as it moves to other cities, tracing how this fragile restart spreads across the plain, becoming the network of Sumerian city-states we know from history. For now, let one image rest with you as you drift towards sleep. A small group of survivors choosing a patch of earth, building a shrine, and then rebuilding it over and over, until that stubborn act of staying becomes known, thousands of years later, as the first city on Earth. Chapter 6. The People Before the Sumerians. Let your breath fall into that slow rhythm again, in and out. We've been walking through Sumerian streets, standing in their temples, listening to their kings. But if you follow the archaeologists a little deeper into the earth, past the familiar Sumerian layers, another world begins to appear, a quieter one, older. A culture that was already there, waiting under the Sumerians' feet, the people we now call Ubaid. Under cities like Eridu and the spades hit walls that are not quite Sumerian. The bricks are a little different. The pottery has its own calm style, greenish paint, simple geometric patterns, cool and restrained. The houses are laid out thoughtfully, rooms arranged around open courtyards, storage spaces, work areas. No sense of first clumsy attempts. The Ubaid levels appear surprisingly organized, as if someone skipped the awkward beginning and went straight to "we know what we're doing." In some of these settlements you find early temples already standing at the center, long halls with altars, side rooms and raised platforms. Small, yes, modest, but clearly planned. Nearby, there are traces of canals and irrigation ditches, carefully cut to guide water where it needs to go. These people are not just camping by the river. They are reshaping the land, coaxing it into steady harvests. From almost the moment they step into the archaeological record, the Ubaid folk look ready. Archaeologists give them dates and labels: Ubaid 1, Ubaid 2, Ubaid 3, neat boxes on charts. But if you imagine their lives, it feels more personal. Families living in long, low houses with plastered floors, children running through courtyards, craftsmen shaping clay into the same simple, elegant bowl over and over, as if everyone has quietly agreed on what a bowl should be. Out in the fields, a network of small canals carries life from the rivers to the crops. There is a sense of calm continuity, as if this way of living has been practiced for a long, long time. We call them before the Sumerians, but that's our timeline. From their point of view, they were just people doing their work, building temples, adjusting canals. And yet, when the Sumerians arrive on the stage of history, they bring a fully formed civilization, cities, writing, complex religion. It is hard not to feel that they stepped into a house whose foundations were already laid. The question sits there like a quiet guest at the table. How much did the Sumerians inherit from these older neighbors in time? Some clues suggest a deep handover. The layout of Ubaid temples and later Sumerian temples feels like a long conversation between generations. The idea of a sacred building in the center, rising above homes and fields, seems to begin here and simply grows taller and more elaborate with time. Even the habit of rebuilding a temple in the exact same spot, layer after layer, the habit we saw at Eridu, belongs as much to the Ubaid world as to Sumer. It's as if the Sumerians didn't invent the idea of holy architecture. They inherited a language of walls and corners already rich with meaning. In some Ubaid sites, there are hints of drainage systems and early plumbing, channels cut beneath floors to carry water away, little ceramic fittings that suggest a careful concern with how water moves through a settlement. Not grand aqueducts, but not improvisation either. Quiet engineering. When you overlay that with later Sumerian canals, levees, and city planning, another thought arrives softly. Maybe the famous first civilization did not spring from nowhere. Maybe they are the grandchildren of an earlier, nearly invisible genius. The Ubaid people themselves left no written records that we have found. No king lists, no myths pressed into clay. Their story comes to us only through shattered pots, worn foundations, and the way later cultures built directly on top of them. It's a little like hearing a conversation where one side of the dialogue is missing. The Sumerians speak loudly in wedge-shaped signs. The Ubaid answer only in bricks and ditches. Still, the imprint is there, a shadow under every Sumerian city saying, "We were here first." As your mind drifts, you might imagine standing on a half-finished Ubaid roof at dusk, watching the sun sink over marshes and fields. You know nothing of Sumerians, or of what will come after you. You only know your house, your temple, your waterways, your sky. But centuries later, other people will claim this land, speak new languages and tell stories about how the gods handed civilization down to them, and somewhere under their feet, your work will still be holding up their world. In our story, that raises a gentle, unsettling question. If the Sumerians inherited so much from a people we barely understand, what did they inherit in turn? How long does the chain of teachers and students really go back? The King List claims that kingship is a gift from heaven. The earth quietly suggests that it might also be a gift from those who came before, now mostly lost in the deep dark of time. Chapter 7, Watchers of the Stars. High above all of this, above Eridu, above the Ubaid villages, above flooded plains and dry seasons, the sky keeps doing what it always does. Stars rise, stars set. The moon waxes and wanes. Bright wanderers we call planets trace slow, looping paths. For most people, the sky is a backdrop. For the Sumerians, it was a text, and they were very patient readers. Picture a Sumerian priest astronomer standing on the flat roof of a temple at dawn. The air is cool, the last stars are fading. On the eastern horizon, a brilliant point of light appears, sometimes as a morning star, sometimes as an evening one. We know it as Venus. They knew it as Inanna or later Ishtar, goddess of love, war, and wild desire. Night after night, year after year, these watchers mark where and when she rises, when she disappears, how long she stays away. Over generations, those quiet notes turn into patterns. Venus doesn't move at random. She has a cycle, appearing, vanishing, returning, tracing a graceful loop against the background of stars. The Sumerians track that cycle with care, turning it into omens, calendars, and timing for rituals. To them, the planet is not just a rock in space. She is a living goddess whose comings and goings whisper something about the fate of kings and the rhythm of time. They watch the moon with equal devotion. Its path is not just pretty, it's complicated. Sometimes eclipses happen when sun, earth, and moon line up in a brief, eerie alignment. Sumerian skywatchers learn to pay attention to the nodes, those invisible crossing points where the moon's path intersects the sun's. They don't draw diagrams the way modern astronomers do, but through long observation, they sense a hidden order. Eclipses are not random scares. They come in families, in cycles, and cycles in their world are the fingerprints of the divine. The temples themselves become instruments. Many are oriented not just for convenience, but for the sky, lined up with solstices, particular star risings, or the path of the moon. On certain days, the first light of dawn might shoot down a central hallway, illuminating an altar. On other nights, a star might rise exactly over a temple corner, as seen from a sacred courtyard. To stand in those spots is to feel that heaven and earth are briefly locked together in a clean, perfect line. As their observations accumulate, the Sumerians and their successors begin to catalogue the stars, naming constellations, tracing patterns, assigning them gods and meanings. The familiar band we now call the zodiac slowly takes shape. Some modern researchers, looking at these patterns and at the way certain myths describe the sky, have suggested something provocative, that some of the constellations appear to reflect the way the heavens looked, not just in Sumerian times, but far earlier. Perhaps around 10,000 BCE, when the slow wobble of Earth's axis, precession, placed the stars in different positions relative to the seasons. Mainstream scholars tend to be cautious with that idea. Precession, as a formal concept, is usually credited to much later astronomers. But even without modern terminology, ancient sky watchers could still notice that the backdrop of the year shifts over great spans of time. The spring sun rises in front of one group of stars for many generations, then, very slowly, another. If priestly families in Mesopotamia kept their records long enough, it's not impossible that they saw hints of this grand, slow turning and wove it quietly into their myths. Imagine a line of watchers stretching across centuries, each one standing where the last one stood, each one comparing notes. In my grandfather's time, the New Year star rose here, one might say, but now it appears a little to the side. They don't have clocks refined enough to measure the shift, but they feel a subtle drift like the slow creaking of a great wheel. For a culture that already treats time as cycles within cycles, this vast age cycle would feel like the deepest rhythm of all, the breath of the cosmos itself. Whether or not they fully grasped precession as we describe it today, there is no doubt that the Sumerians and their heirs looked up with extraordinary attention. They tracked Venus's strange dance, the moon's hidden nodes, the stately march of Jupiter and Saturn, the timing of eclipses. Then they tied those observations to human life, to harvests, wars, coronations. The sky was not separate from their history. It was the stage on which their history played, and also the script. As you lie there, you can imagine being one of those rooftop watchers. The city below is falling quiet. Somewhere, a dog barks, then stops. Above, the stars sharpen against the velvet dark. You have a simple toolkit, your eyes, a few marked posts, maybe a cord or a rod to line things up. But what you really have is time, night after night, year after year. You notice which stars mark planting season, which rise with the floods which seem to herald storms or peace, and slowly the sky becomes less a mystery and more a familiar living map. In our story, this raises another gentle question. If the Sumerian star lore hints at patterns that reach back before civilization officially begins, if some constellations fit an older sky, then perhaps they too were heirs. Not only of Ubaid architects and canal builders, but of even earlier sky watchers whose names are gone. People who had nothing but their eyes, their firelight, and a very long memory. People who stared up, as you might do now, and felt that the lights above were speaking in a language worth learning. Chapter 8: The Kings Before the Flood. Settle into the quiet, and imagine a time that exists mostly in whispers, on the far side of the flood. The Sumerian King List begins its tale with figures who seem less like men and more like symbols, kings whose names sound like pieces of a forgotten spell: Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenlu-Ana, Enmengal-Ana, Dumuzi the shepherd. Take Alulim. In some readings, his name carries the sense of horned one or primordial ruler, as if he isn't just a person, but the idea of kingship itself taking shape. The list says calmly that he ruled in Eridu for tens of thousands of years. To us, that feels impossible. To the Sumerian mind, the name and the number together seem to say, this was the age when rule itself first descended, an era, a dawn, a long, slow beginning. Then comes Alalgar, linked to the city of Eridu as well. His name hints at brightness, at a shining or resounding presence, a kind of echo after the first strike of a bell. Some scholars see in these names the rhythm of cosmic phases, first the silent establishment of order, then an age in which that order reverberates outward. Not human kings pacing palace floors, but great stretches of time given a face and a story. Enmenlu-Ana and Enmengal-Ana follow, their names dense with meaning. En is Lord. Men can relate to destiny or office. Ana to heaven. One way to feel these names is as Lord of the heavenly decrees, Great Lord of the heavenly decrees. Rulers whose authority is less about land and more about the blueprint of the cosmos itself. If you listen closely, each king sounds a bit like a title or even a function, not just a single man. Dumuzi the shepherd appears next, a name you may recognize from later myths, where he becomes a dying and rising figure, a beloved of goddesses, a symbol of vegetation that withers and returns. On the king list, his reign is also vast, but his very title, the shepherd, feels pastoral, seasonal, cyclical. It is easy to imagine that this king embodies a long age in which the rhythms of flocks and fields defined life, a whole era of the world, written as the life of one shining, half-divine figure. When modern readers face these names, there's a temptation to turn them into a neat little genealogy. First this king, then that one. But another way to listen is to hear them as chapter headings in a cosmic history, each name marking a long astronomical or cultural cycle. Just as later astrologers speak of ages ruled by certain constellations, some researchers suspect that these antediluvian kings may align with grand sky patterns, slow precessional ages, or repeating planetary configurations remembered in mythic skin. Think of it this way. If you are a priest scribe in a temple, and you have inherited very old knowledge, star cycles, floods, strange climate shifts, how do you keep it alive among people who cannot read tables of numbers? You wrap those cycles in stories of kings. You say, in the age of Alulim, this was the way of the world. In the age of Dumuzi, that was the pattern. Over time, listeners forget that the names once stood for eons. They remember only that long ago, nearly eternal rulers walked the earth. The king list itself adds a curious detail. It repeats almost like a refrain. After kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu. Then it was in Bad Tibira. Then in Larak. Kingship moves, like a wandering star, from city to city. If each antediluvian reign covers a vast cycle, this movement could reflect shifts in the sky, new constellations rising in importance, planets changing their places at key moments of the year. The cities become anchors on earth for patterns written in light. So when you hear those old names, Alulim, Alalgar, and Menluana, you can imagine them not as bearded elders sitting on dusty thrones for 20,000 years, but as masks worn by time itself. Each king is an age. Each enormous number is a measure not of birthdays, but of grand cycles in the heavens or long dynasties of forgotten peoples before the flood reset the world. The Sumerians do not explain this openly. They simply hand us the list and let the names sit there, heavy with meaning. In the quiet before sleep, you might let those names drift across your thoughts like slow stars. They belong to a world that the Sumerians themselves treated with a kind of sacred distance, real enough to list, mysterious enough to leave veiled. Between their syllables lie questions about how long humanity has really been watching the sky, and about how much we still remember. Chapter 9. The Role of Enki. Beneath the brick platforms of Eridu, beneath the canals and marsh reeds, the Sumerians believed there was another realm, the Abzu, the deep freshwater ocean under the earth. Cool, dark, and life-giving. The lord of that hidden sea was Enki. When you speak his name, you're touching one of the oldest, most quietly important figures in their entire world. Enki is not a thunder god or a warlord. He doesn't stride across the sky hurling bolts. He belongs to water that seeps and springs, to wisdom that comes in dreams, to clever solutions whispered at the last possible moment. He is often pictured with streams flowing from his shoulders, filled with fish and life. Around him are symbols of craft and knowledge, reeds for writing, tools, signs of art and magic. If other gods make loud decisions, Enki is the one who leans in and says, "There's another way, let me show you." In flood stories from Mesopotamia, when the great gods decide that humankind must be wiped away, it is Enki who cannot quite bear it. The reasons change from version to version, humans too noisy, too numerous, too flawed. But the outcome is the same. A council in heaven, a terrible verdict, a plan for a world-drowning deluge. The gods swear secrecy. Enki, bound by oath, finds a loophole. He does not speak directly to the chosen man, Ziusudra or Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, depending on the telling. Instead, he speaks to a wall, to a reed house, to the air. House of reeds, pay attention. Man inside, listen. Through that gentle trick, he passes on the instructions. Build a boat, seal it tight, bring life aboard. It's not a grand rebellion. It's more like a quiet act of mercy. Enki does not stop the flood, but he makes sure it is not total. In doing so, he becomes the thin bridge between an old-ending world and the bruised, hopeful one that will start again afterward. Without him, the King List would have nothing to write after that short, terrible line. Then the flood swept over. His temple in Eridu, the Abzu, House of the Abzu, was remembered as the oldest of all temples. Over and over, generations rebuilt it on the same spot, turning a simple shrine into a layered mound of devotion. Inside those walls, priests tended pools of fresh water, performed rituals of purification, and sought dreams and omens. If there was a place on earth where the wisdom of before the flood might have survived, wrapped in ritual and story, many would point here. Enki's house was not just a local sanctuary, it was a kind of memory vault. Imagine that, after a great catastrophe, a small group of survivors arrived at the site that would become Eridu. They know the rivers are dangerous. They have seen water as both destroyer and savior. To live, they must master it, channel it gently, call up the sweet underground flows, tame the floods without forgetting their power. What better patron than a god who rules the deep waters, and who once bent the rules to save a handful of humans? They build him a house of mud brick. They mark it as the place where heaven's pity touched earth. As centuries turn, Enki's role widens. He becomes patron of craftsmen, scribes, and incantation priests. When someone needs a ritual to heal, a formula to cleanse, a design for a new tool, they ask Enki. He knows the secret names of things. He understands the pattern beneath the surface. In some myths, the very me, the divine decrees that define civilization, from kingship to music, rest in his keeping. At times he loans them out. At times others try to steal them. But always he is tied to the deep code of how the world works. If the Sumerians inherited knowledge from earlier, partially forgotten cultures, the Ubaid or even older peoples, Enki is the perfect divine face for that inheritance. A god of wisdom who saves a thread of humanity from drowning. A lord of the Abzu whose temple sits on top of layer after layer of rebuilding. A keeper of sacred designs who can hand them to new cities when the time is right. He's not just a character in stories, he's the mythic embodiment of continuity. In this light, Enki's temple at Eridu begins to look like more than the oldest shrine. It becomes a symbolic bridge between two civilizations, the world before the flood and the world after. Inside its walls, priests chant words whose roots may stretch back further than we know. Outside, new generations of builders, farmers, and rulers experiment with city life. When they claim that kingship descended there first, perhaps what they really mean is that remembered order settled there, old wisdom taking new form. As you rest, you can picture Enki not as a distant statue, but as an idea moving quietly through our story. Whenever there is a narrow escape, a clever workaround, a hidden store of knowledge that survives when everything else is washed away, Enki's hand is said to be there. He stands waist-deep in the cool dark of the Abzu, watching over both the ruins of drowned worlds and the fragile lights of new ones. And in Eridu, in his layered house by the marshes, that watchfulness became stone, water, and whispered prayer. Chapter 10. Sacred Geometry and the Code of the Cosmos. Let your thoughts slow down again, like footsteps turning into a soft walk. Now imagine standing at the foot of a Sumerian temple, not the tall, later ziggurats you might picture, but their earlier, simpler forms. Low platforms, stepped walls, crisp corners. Nothing here is random. Every brick, every angle has been argued with the sky. The Sumerians didn't just stack mud where it was convenient. They built with proportions, quiet ratios that repeat from one temple to another, length to width, height to base. The same patterns echo in foundations, in room layouts, in courtyards. To us, it looks like architecture. To them, it was closer to music you could walk inside. Numbers became a kind of rhythm in clay. Their beloved base 60 sat at the heart of this rhythm. 60 wasn't just for counting sheep or jars of grain. It shaped the very way they carved space, rectangles divided into thirds, sixths, twelfths, angles that fell neatly into the circle of 360 degrees, 6 times 60. The same circle modern astronomers still use to draw the paths of planets. When you stand in a Sumerian temple, you're standing inside the same numerical language that marks our clocks and our star charts today. From the temple roofs, those priest astronomers watch the sky. Below their feet, the building itself helped them keep time. A doorway facing a certain horizon point, a wall catching the first light of the solstice sunrise, a stair where the full moon would cast a straight line of shadow on specific nights. Over years of watching, they turned these observations into habit. Over generations, habit hardened into design. The next temple didn't just face east, it faced the exact point where a certain star rose at a sacred moment of the year. In that sense, the temples became stone calendars, or clay calendars to be more precise. The people below might not know the equations, but they knew the results. When the sun strikes this corner, a priest could say, we begin the festival. When Venus appears along that edge of the roof, we wait 3 days and then we plant. The building itself told them where they were in the year. The walls remembered, even when human memory faltered. You can think of it as code. Today our devices run on hidden patterns, zeros and ones shaping everything we see and do. For the Sumerians, sacred geometry was a kind of early code, ratios and orientations that linked heaven and earth. A temple aligned to the 4 cardinal directions wasn't just well placed. It said, this place is stitched into the fabric of the world. What happens here is in step with the cosmos. As we learned earlier, their numbers traveled with them into the sky. 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, careful tracking of planetary cycles. Seeing those same values in their temples is like realizing that the same melody runs through both the music and the dance. Their buildings and their astronomy were not separate disciplines. They were two expressions of one underlying idea, that the universe runs on quiet, elegant order, and that humans can choose to build in harmony with it. As you breathe slowly, you might picture yourself walking through one of these temples at dawn. The corridors are cool, the smell of incense lingers. A line of sunlight slides along the floor, comes to rest exactly on a carved niche. No one needs to shout that a new season has begun. The architecture itself has spoken. The code of the cosmos has been read, not on a screen, but in stone and shadow. In our next chapter, we'll turn from geometry to myth again, from the bricks and angles of the temple to the beings said to have taught humans how to build such things at all. For now, let one thought rest gently beside you. The Sumerians were not just stacking bricks. They were writing equations in clay, turning their temples into three-dimensional calendars that whispered softly and endlessly of the order behind the stars. Chapter 11. The Abzu and the Lost Wisdom. Deep beneath those temples, in the imagination of the Sumerians, lay the Abzu, the hidden freshwater deep, cool, silent, dark as thought before it becomes a word. To them, this wasn't just a subterranean lake. It was the source of wisdom and life, and from its shadowed waters, they said, came strange, shining teachers, the Apkallu. The Apkallu are described as 7 sages, not quite men, not quite fish. In some depictions, they stand upright like humans, but with the tails or cloaks of fish, as if they have stepped halfway out of the sea and decided to stay. In others, they wear horned crowns and carry small buckets and pine cones, symbols of purification, of blessing, of some ritual whose full meaning we've forgotten. Around them, cuneiform texts whisper that they taught humanity what it needed to survive. According to later lists and myths, each Apkallu served a king before the flood. One sage for each early ruler, walking beside him, advising, correcting, revealing. They are credited with giving people the arts of agriculture, how to dig canals, how to tend fields, how to read the moods of the soil. They bring writing so that words and numbers won't vanish with the breath that spoke them. They introduce laws and rituals, not to crush life but to guide it, to keep a fragile society from tearing itself apart. It is as if in the Sumerian mind, civilization did not grow only from human trial and error. It was also handed down, taught, gifted, by beings who had one foot in the human world and one in the deep. If ordinary people learned slowly, stumbling, the Apkallu moved with the confidence of those who already knew. They are remembered less as experimenters and more as rememberers. The ones who recall how things are meant to work. Now imagine this not as literal fishmen walking out of the marshes, but as a story carrying a deeper hint. When a culture says, "Our knowledge came from sages of the Abzu," it might be saying, "Our teachers came from somewhere beyond our present world." From a deeper layer of time. Some modern interpreters suggest softly that the Apkallu could represent survivors of an earlier advanced culture, people who carried skills and memories through the chaos of floods and climate shifts, then passed them on to the next round of humanity. Picture it. A small group of people with unusual knowledge arrives in a land trying to rebuild. They understand irrigation in a way others don't. They can mark the stars and predict when rivers will swell. They know how to shape clay into durable tablets, how to organize a city so it doesn't fall apart in its own confusion. To frightened, recovering communities, such figures would seem half divine. Their origin stories would sink quickly into myth. Not "we came from a ruined coastal city to the west," but "we came from the Abzu, from the deep place where wisdom lives." The number 7 itself is not accidental. In Mesopotamian thought, 7 is a sacred count. 7 gates, 7 planets, 7 decrees. To have 7 Apkallu is to say, this is a complete set, a full gift. They are like the first installers of civilization, unpacking its features one by one. In some traditions, after the flood, only their shadows remain. Lesser sages, human priests and seers, who carry fragments of the original knowledge, never quite matching the clarity of the first 7. Back in Eridu, in Enki's temple, priests would have told stories of these beings to explain why their rituals, their canals, their writing mattered so much. Every carefully dug channel, every clay tablet, every legal judgment could be traced back in imagination to an Apkallu's lesson. Civilization, then, is not just a human achievement. It is a trust, something received from wise guardians of the deep. To misuse it is not only foolish, it is ungrateful. As your breathing stays soft and even, you might picture the Apkallu in a quieter way, not as literal figures splashing up from underground waters, but as emblems of lost teachers, lost eras, lost clarity. We all, in some sense, live downstream from people we will never meet, whose discoveries we barely understand. The Sumerians gave those forgotten benefactors names, shapes, and fishtails. They housed them in the Abzu, beside Enki, in the cool underground where memory does not burn away. In our story, the Apkallu stand at the threshold between worlds, between a civilization that fell beneath floods and one that rose afterward. They are the imagined hands that carried fire from one age to the next. The video's suggestion that they might be echoes of a real earlier people is less a claim than a hope. That wisdom does not die easily, that somewhere, somehow, it finds a way to swim through the dark and surface again. Chapter 12. The Sudden Rise of Civilization. Let yourself sink a little deeper into the mattress. Feel your breath move in and out like a slow tide. While you rest, we'll walk into a curious puzzle, one that has bothered archaeologists for more than a century. It begins in the flat plains of southern Mesopotamia, where, almost out of nowhere, the Sumerians appear in the record looking strangely complete. Not half-finished, not fumbling. Ready. When we first meet them clearly, the Sumerians already have cities, real cities. Streets, neighborhoods, specialized districts, temples rising at the center like stepped hills, storage rooms for grain, workshops for metal and pottery, houses arranged along lanes that feel planned, not accidental. There isn't much of a visible learning phase where people are trying a dozen different layouts and failing. It's as if someone skipped the rough draft and handed them the final version. The same is true of writing. The earliest Sumerian tablets we've found are not random scratches. They're already little ledgers and records, counts of grain, lists of offerings, contracts, temple inventories. The signs are still partly pictorial, yes, but the system is there. Standardized shapes, repeated values, patterns of grammar beginning to form. In most other places, writing crawls into existence slowly. Here in the mud of Uruk and Ur, it seems to step forward in a single confident stride. Laws, too, show up with that same strange maturity. Long before famous codes like Hammurabi's, Sumerian cities are already dealing with contracts, debts, land disputes, marriage agreements. The tablets don't read like people inventing justice from scratch. They sound more like people organizing and refining something they already think should exist. The proper way, the just measure. They argue over details, but the idea that life should be ruled by written law arrives as if it's an old friend. Medicine is there as well, hiding in small, unassuming tablets. Lists of symptoms, recipes of herbs and minerals, descriptions of wounds, fevers, strange troubles of the mind and heart. Some prescriptions lean heavily on incantations and ritual. Others look frankly clinical. Do this, apply that, wait this long. The border between magic and medicine is soft, but beneath it you feel a steady, methodical concern with how bodies work. Not the first clumsy attempts of people who have never thought about illness before, but the notes of a tradition already underway. And always in the background stands their mathematics, this elegant base 60 system that seems perfectly suited to astronomy, geometry, and trade. They use it to weigh silver, to measure fields, to track the movements of stars. When we look back from our own modern vantage point, it's hard not to feel a jolt. Their way of counting still shapes our clocks and circles. Once again, it doesn't feel like a first experiment. It feels like something inherited, polished, trusted. So archaeologists and historians look at this sudden cluster, cities, writing, law, medicine, math, And they ask, where is the long, messy staircase that leads up to this platform? In some ways, we've already seen hints of it. The Ubaid people below, the quiet engineers of canals, the careful temple builders. But even with them, there's a sense that the Sumerians are standing on a taller stack of invisible steps, layers of trial and error, observation and memory that simply haven't survived in forms we can easily read. The Sumerians themselves did not say, "We invented all of this." Their own stories insist on something different. Kingship descends from heaven. The arts of civilization are gifts, from Enki, from the Apkallu, from gods who pull wisdom out of the deep. In our language, we might translate that as, we were taught, we received, we inherited. For a people whose world had already survived at least one great reset, it makes a kind of quiet sense. They walked into the ruins of older ways of life and took up what could be saved. As your eyes grow heavy, you might imagine a Sumerian scribe looking over a tablet full of numbers and names, feeling not pride, but responsibility. Behind his stylus stand generations of unknown hands. Behind his city rise the unmarked foundations of lost villages. When we say that civilization appeared suddenly in Sumer, perhaps what we really mean is that it reappeared, blooming quickly from seeds sown long before by teachers and cultures whose stories now lie mostly under the sand. Chapter 13, Language and Writing as Magic. There is a special kind of quiet in a room where someone is writing, not speaking, not shouting, just pressing thoughts into a surface, one small mark at a time. For the Sumerians, that act was more than practical. It was a kind of magic, a way to make breath solid, to freeze time, to let words outlive the mouths that spoke them. Picture a scribe seated on a low stool, a soft tablet of clay in his lap. He dips his stylus and a trimmed reed, and begins to press wedge-shaped signs into the surface. Each tap is small, almost trivial, but together they form an agreement between two people, or a prayer to a god, or a record of something that actually happened in the world. When he finishes, he sets the tablet aside to dry. The moment has passed, yet in another sense it's still there, waiting for anyone who can read to step back into it. To people who were used to memory living only in song and story, this must have felt uncanny. A spoken word vanishes as soon as it is heard. A written one persists. Long after the speaker dies, the tablet can still talk. You can walk into a room, pick up a piece of clay, and hear someone who lived 300 years before you making a complaint about a field, or describing a ritual, or arguing with a neighbor. No wonder writing was first the tool of temples and palaces. It was powerful, almost dangerous. The Sumerians surrounded this power with ritual and training. Scribes studied for years in tablet schools, copying lists, practicing signs, memorizing proverbs and hymns. Learning to write wasn't just job preparation, it was initiation. When you mastered the stylus, you joined the small band of people who could shape reality with marks. A badly kept account could cause real loss. A wrongly written omen could provoke fear or hope in a whole city. Words mattered, and written words had sharp edges. Among the tablets we've found, some feel surprisingly modern. There are collections of proverbs that sound like tiny philosophical jokes. A scribe who does not know Sumerian. What kind of scribe is he? There are debates between personified concepts, arguments between summer and winter, between bird and fish, that read like early exercises in abstract thought. There are hymns that ponder the nature of the gods, laments that question suffering, little dialogues that ask in their own way, what does it mean to live well in a world ruled by forces we don't fully understand? Alongside these we find texts that look like pure science, lists of plants and their properties, catalogues of stones, observations of planets, eclipses, river levels. To us, those may feel like separate categories, poetry over here, science over there, law in another room entirely. For the Sumerian scribes, they all flowed from the same source. The stylus didn't care whether it was drawing a love song or a mathematical table. The magic was the same, taking something fleeting and pinning it gently to clay. There is also a quiet kindness hidden in this magic. By stabilizing knowledge, writing makes it shareable across distance and time. A healer in one city can learn from the remedies noted in another. A judge faced with a difficult case can consult earlier decisions. A student centuries later can copy a hymn written by someone who lived in a different era, under different kings, and still feel the ache and wonder in the words. Writing doesn't just preserve information, it preserves experience. Of course, the Sumerians still believed in spoken spells, in incantations whispered over water, in prayers sung to the dawn. But even there, writing crept in. Many ritual tablets contain the exact words a priest must say, the gestures to make, the sequence of actions. The magic, once fluid and improvised, becomes something like a script. That shift has a cost, less spontaneity perhaps, but it also means that the ritual can be repeated accurately long after the first priest is gone. The performance becomes a kind of playback of an original moment. As you lie there, you might think of all those tablets that have slept in the ground for millennia. To us they look humble, cracked, brown, covered in tiny marks. Yet when we decipher them, whole worlds unfold, lists and laws, songs and sorrows, sharp complaints and gentle jokes. The Sumerians turned language into an instrument that could reach across ages. In doing so, they made it possible for you right now to hear their voices in the dark. In our story, calling writing magic isn't just a metaphor. It captures the awe of that first realization that by arranging a small set of signs in the right way, you can cause understanding to appear in another person's mind, even if you never meet, even if you are separated by centuries. The Sumerians were among the first to work that spell in clay. And every book, every screen, every quiet story you listen to at night is in a way an echo of their discovery. Words, made durable. Breath, given a second life. Chapter 14. The Hidden Cities Beneath the Persian Gulf. Breathe in slowly, and out. Now let your mind drift to a place that on most maps is just a patch of blue. The Persian Gulf, a stretch of shallow sea between Arabia and Iran. Today, ships cross it, rigs drill it, waves curl and break on its shores. But long ago, when the world was colder and ice gripped more of the poles, that sea was something else entirely. It was land. Imagine a wide green plain where now there is water. Rivers, ancestors of the Tigris and Euphrates, wander across it in braided channels. Marshes spread in quiet pools. Patches of higher ground rise like islands of earth in a sea of reeds and grass. To the north, the early cities we know, Eridu, Ur, sit at the edge of this world. To the south, where water now rolls, people once walked, planted, and built. As the last ice age loosened its hold, meltwater poured into the oceans. Sea levels began to rise. Not all at once, not in a single roaring wave, but in long, uneven pulses. Every few generations, the shoreline crept a little farther inland. Villages that had stood by safe riverbanks found their fields turning to brackish mud. People moved. They climbed to higher ground, carried their tools, their stories, their gods. Behind them, the low country vanished under a slow, relentless flood. Geologists and ocean floor surveys hint at this drowned world. Buried river channels trace ghostly lines beneath the Gulf. Sediment cores suggest old floodplains where fish now swim. It's as if someone took a slice of southern Mesopotamia with all its fertile potential and simply laid a sheet of water over it. When you think of the Sumerians appearing suddenly in the historical record, you have to wonder how much of their earlier story lies out there, hidden under those shallow waves. Picture for a moment a network of small towns on that lost plain. Not glittering stone cities, except we don't need to exaggerate, but sturdy, organized settlements. Fields laid out in careful rows, canals cut by practiced hands, shrines to gods of water and sky. As the sea rose, those communities would have faced a choice: cling to sinking land or move inland and rebuild along the shrinking edge. Many would have chosen to move, carrying with them memories of a home the water took. When later generations in Mesopotamia spoke of a great deluge, of a time when the lower world was swallowed by the sea, of lands to the south where gods once walked among humans. Maybe they weren't only speaking in symbols. Maybe they were remembering in mythic language this slow drowning of an entire landscape. A whole earlier chapter of civilization, washed over and sealed beneath the Gulf's calm surface. Some researchers quietly suggest that if a previous civilization fed into Sumer, its traces may lie there, under silt, under salt water, under thousands of years of forgetting. Not necessarily cities of shining glass and impossible machines. More likely towns and proto-cities whose sophistication would still surprise us, advanced irrigation, complex social ties, star law already forming. Places that taught the ancestors of the Sumerians what was possible. As you lie there, you can imagine boats gliding across that same gulf today, their hulls passing a few dozen meters above buried riverbeds. The people on deck check their phones, talk about tomorrow. Far below, in the dark and the quiet, rest the erased edges of old plains. The Sumerians, standing on the northern shore thousands of years ago, might have looked out over that water and felt what refugees everywhere feel. We used to live out there. Our stories started in a place we can no longer touch. In our tale, those submerged lands become the perfect hiding place for an earlier half-remembered world. Not hidden by conspiracy, just hidden by time, by water, by the way coastlines shift while human memory tries to keep up. The Gulf, then, is not only a sea. It is a mirror reflecting back a question. How much of what we call the beginning is really just the part that stayed above water? Chapter 15, The Rewriting of History. History, as we know it, often arrives in the voice of whoever held the pen last. After the Sumerians came others, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, scribes of Israel and Judah, each picking up old stories and turning them in their hands like pieces of colored glass. The shapes stayed familiar, but the colors changed. In Babylon, the god Marduk rose to the top of the divine family tree. In older Sumerian myths, creation and order were shared among many deities: An, Enlil, Enki, Inanna. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, echoes of those older tales are rearranged. A sea dragon goddess is slain. The hero god slices her in two to form heaven and earth. He organizes the stars, fixes their paths, gives humans their tasks. The structure feels ancient. The names are different. The message is clear. Babylon's god is now the central pillar of the cosmos. Assyrian kings followed a similar pattern in their inscriptions. They inherited Sumerian and Babylonian lists of rulers, patterns of boasting, formulaic phrases about conquest and favor from the gods. But they sharpened them. Victories grew more absolute. Enemies became more wicked, more deserving of destruction. Assyrian scribes knew how to emphasize certain ancestors, downplay others, smooth over interruptions in the royal line. The past becomes a tidy staircase leading up to the current king's throne. When the Persians swept in under Cyrus and Darius, they brought their own way of telling the story. In royal inscriptions, they cast themselves as restorers, chosen by a supreme, singular god to put things right. Babylon becomes a city needing rescue. Older gods shrink into local spirits or dignified but subordinate figures. Yet beneath the new theology, old place names and rituals persist, like an older song playing softly under a louder one. The Greeks, arriving with their curiosity and their gift for system, listened to local Babylonian priests and brought fragments of Mesopotamian lore into their own writings. They spoke of Chaldean star watchers, of floods and ancient kings. But they fitted these tales into Greek frameworks, linking foreign gods with their own, reshaping dates and genealogies so the grand story of the world would make sense from their point of view. What didn't fit was trimmed. What did fit was polished. Even in the traditions that would become Jewish and Christian scripture, we can feel the Sumerian and Babylonian roots under the soil. A garden with a special tree, a serpent, a great flood, and a single family in a vessel, a tower reaching toward heaven. These motifs are reworked with new meanings, new moral centers, a fiercely monotheistic heart. The old Mesopotamian background is not erased entirely, but it is carefully repainted. The focus shifts from many gods to one, from cycles of ages to a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. None of this is simple theft. It is something more human and more complicated. Each new empire, each new faith looks back and asks, where do we come from? Why do we rule? Why are we here? Old stories become raw material. Kings and priests keep what serves their vision, rewrite what troubles it, quietly let other parts fall silent. The past is not left untouched. It is edited, sometimes gently, sometimes with a heavy hand. For the Sumerians, kingship came down from heaven to Eridu, then moved from city to city. For later Babylonians, it made more sense if kingship found its true home in Babylon. For Assyrians, the line of destiny led, of course, to Nineveh or Assur. For Judean scribes, the center became Zion, the covenant, a single God guiding history. At each step, the map of meaning is redrawn, even if the shape of the land underneath stays the same. As you rest, you can picture shelves of clay tablets and scrolls, copied and recopied across centuries, a scribe scratching out a name and writing another above it, a priest rephrasing an old hymn so that a new god stands where an old one once did, a historian choosing which kings are legitimate enough to include, which to skip as embarrassments. No sinister cloak and dagger, just ordinary people doing what people do, shaping memory to serve the present. In our story, this slow layered rewriting explains why the Sumerian King List feels both foundational and strangely muffled. Later cultures borrowed its bones, long ages, great floods, chosen rulers, but dressed them in new clothes. The original voices grow faint beneath the commentary, yet they are still there if you listen closely. Chapter 16. The Battle with Modern Academia. Let your breath slow again. In and out. We've wandered through flood myths, drowned plains, sacred numbers. Now the story steps into a quieter, more human kind of storm. Not of water or fire, but of disagreement. The past does not only live in the ground. It also lives in lecture halls, journals, and conference rooms, where people argue about what the evidence is allowed to mean. Imagine a group of scholars in a dim museum office, surrounded by trays of tablets and fragments. They are trained to be cautious. Their job is to weigh every claim, to demand proof, to avoid being fooled by wishful thinking. For them, the safer path is to explain everything with slow, gradual steps. Simple villages become towns, towns become cities, knowledge accumulates bit by bit. It's a comforting staircase, no sudden jumps, no lost chapters. Then on the table in front of them lies a tablet that seems out of place. A text tracking the cycle of Venus with uncanny precision, a list of square roots written in base 60, accurate to a level that embarrasses much later eras, a recipe for mixing alloys at temperatures that shouldn't have been easy to control with ancient furnaces. Each piece taken alone can be described, catalogued, gently filed away. Together they whisper something more unsettling. Someone, long ago, was very good at this. The video's narrator looks at those whispers and asks, "Why don't we talk about this more?" He sees a pattern in the reluctance. When evidence of high astronomy appears in old clay, it's often dismissed as ritual, omen lore, proto-science. When complex math shows up, it's framed as an oddity, not a sign of wider sophistication. When metalwork or engineering seems advanced, it's credited to trial and error luck. Anything, as long as the big story, slow, simple progress from ignorance to enlightenment, remains untouched. From the scholar's side, there is another worry. If they admit that some ancient cultures were more advanced in certain areas than the standard timeline suggests, they fear opening the door to wild theories, alien builders, secret continents, impossible machines. They want to keep the ground solid under their feet. So they tighten their definitions, set high bars for proof, and leave some questions sitting in a corner politely ignored. It's not a conspiracy with shadowy meetings. It's a human instinct to protect a hard-won framework. The clash becomes, in a way, a clash of stories. One story says, civilization is a steady climb. The Sumerians were bright, but not mysterious. We can explain them with what we already know. The other says, no, something about them still doesn't fit. Their knowledge looks inherited, not invented. There are gaps in the staircase, places where we seem to jump to a higher step with no visible steps in between. Both sides point to the same clay. Both insist they are being reasonable. You can picture a conference where someone presents a paper on a Sumerian tablet that appears to encode surprisingly accurate astronomical cycles. Some listeners nod politely, then return to safer topics. Others lean forward, intrigued. A few roll their eyes, worried about their field's reputation. Afterward, in the hallway, the real conversation happens in quick, low voices. Interesting but speculative. It's probably symbolic. Let's not get carried away. The ancient tablet sits in its case, unchanged by their reactions. The video invites us to stand a little closer and listen to the clay more literally, to consider that when a scribe writes careful numbers about Venus or builds a temple that acts as a calendar, he might not be dabbling. He might be practicing a tradition already mature. The resistance, then, is not to the tablet itself, but to what it might force us to admit, that the roots of human knowledge run deeper and more unevenly than our tidy charts show. As you breathe softly, you don't need to pick a side. You can simply hold the tension. On one hand, the need for rigor, for careful, grounded explanations. On the other, the humility to say, we don't fully understand how they learned all this. The real battle with modern academia is often just this, the struggle between comfort and curiosity, between protecting what we think we know and letting the past surprise us. In our story, the Sumerians are not props for any theory. They are a mirror. They reflect our own habits back at us, our tendency to downplay what doesn't fit, to smooth out the strange, to prefer a world where everything advances in neat lines. But history, like a river, rarely flows so cleanly. Sometimes it leaps, sometimes it forgets. Sometimes a very old light shines through a tiny crack of clay, and we have to decide whether to squint and pretend we don't see it, or to widen the crack and let more of that light in. Chapter 17, Clay Memory. The clay does not lie. Close your eyes for a moment and think of clay, not as just mud or dirt, but as something alive with possibility. Wet clay takes the shape of your hand. It remembers every press of your fingers, every small line you carve into it. When the Sumerians chose clay as their main writing surface, they weren't just picking what was close at hand. They were choosing a kind of memory that could outlast fire, water, and time. Picture a fresh tablet, still soft, resting on a scribe's palm. In that moment, it is like a little piece of the present, waiting to be filled. He leans over, stylus poised, and begins to press. Each wedge is a decision. This number, not that one. This word, not another. A misunderstanding now could cause real trouble later, so he works carefully. Behind him, the city murmurs and clatters, loud with life. Inside the tablet, silence gathers around the marks. When he finishes, someone might dry the tablet in the sun. Sometimes, for important texts, they bake it in a kiln, turning frail mud into something closer to stone. The scribe's heart rate slows. The transaction is sealed. The prayer is fixed. The king's boast is preserved. For the people involved, the tablet is simply a document, useful, perhaps sacred, but still part of everyday life. No one is thinking, in 4,000 years someone will dig this up and read it. Then time rolls on. Fires sweep through cities. Enemies knock down walls. Earthquakes shake the ground. Rivers change course. Libraries burn. Papyrus scrolls crumble into dust. Leather rots. Faces and voices disappear. But under collapsed roofs and in ruined archives, the humble clay remains. Broken, perhaps. Scorched. Buried. Yet still holding its tiny wedges, still keeping the shape of thoughts that once moved through a living mind. Archaeologists find these tablets by the thousands. Some are treasure, epics, poems, detailed records. Others are almost comically ordinary, receipts for deliveries, lists of goats, notes about small debts and arguments. Together, they form what you could call a clay memory, a distributed archive of a vanished world. The Sumerians did not plan to talk to the future, but clay made it possible anyway. The video likes to say, "The clay does not lie." That doesn't mean every statement on a tablet is factually perfect. Scribes could exaggerate, kings could boast, omens could be misread. But the clay preserves the honesty of the moment. It records what people chose to say, what they thought mattered, how they saw themselves and their gods. Unlike stories retold 100 times by word of mouth, a tablet fixes one version in place. Later texts can argue with it. They can reinterpret it. They cannot make it disappear. There is something strangely comforting in that. Civilizations rise and fall, laws change, empires rewrite genealogies and myths, but the clay at the bottom layer still quietly says, "This is what they wrote then." When a later scribe tries to smooth over an awkward king or a lost battle, the older tablet underneath may tell a different story. The ground becomes a kind of courtroom where the past can testify for itself. As you listen, imagine walking down rows of shelves in a museum archive. Not the flashy displays in glass cases, but the long, quiet back rooms. Each small tablet lies in its own tray, tagged with a number. To an untrained eye, they all look the same, brown, chipped, modest. But each one is a rescued thought, a fear, a hope, a complaint about bad barley. A father's name written for the first time by a trembling student. A poet's line about a goddess's sadness. A scholar's careful note about a strange position of the moon. Even when cities were destroyed deliberately, libraries looted, statues smashed, names chiseled off, many tablets simply fell, were covered by rubble, and slept. Fire that would consume papyrus only hardened the clay further. Water that would smear ink sometimes washed mud over a tablet, sealing it in. The same elements that erase other kinds of memory often help clay endure. It is as if the earth itself insists on keeping a record, whether we want it to or not. As you drift towards sleep, you might think of your own life in that light. The words you say, the small notes you leave, the messages that move through glowing screens. Much of it will vanish, but some traces will remain, in backups, in letters, in corners of the web or in some box in an attic. The Sumerians' gift, unintentionally, was to show us that memory is stronger than we think. Even when whole civilizations are ground down to dust, a fragment of clay in a forgotten room can still speak. In our story, this is the quiet reassurance beneath all the mystery and debate, that the past is not entirely lost. It leaves fingerprints in layers of mud and fired earth. And when we pick up a tablet and learn to read its tiny marks, we are not inventing theories out of nothing. We are listening gently, patiently, to what the clay has been holding for thousands of years, waiting for someone someday to understand. Chapter 18, The Mystery of 241,000 Years. Take another slow breath, in and out. We've walked through temples, floods, drowned plains, and patient scholars. Now the story circles back to a single stubborn number, one that has been waiting quietly since the beginning of our tale, 200 years. The total time the Sumerian King List says 8 kings ruled before the flood, not 8 lifetimes, 8 reigns. A span so large it almost stops feeling real. For a long time, most readers treated that number like decorative paint, pretty but not meant to be taken seriously. Yet the more we've looked at Sumerian thought, the harder it is to call it random. Their numbers were careful. Their base 60 system was elegant and deliberate. When they wrote 241-200, they weren't just hitting a handful of keys at random. They were stacking meaningful units, sars and nurs, great blocks of 60 piled into a towering column of time. Imagine that column not as a calendar of birthdays, but as a scale for eras. One block might represent a long astronomical cycle, the slow turning of the sky through different constellations. Another might stand for an age of climate, a pattern of warm and cold, flood and drought. To compress all of that into the reign of a single king is to say, during this enormous stretch, the world was under a certain kind of order. The king is less a man in a crown, more a face on a chapter of the cosmos. If you let your mind rest on that number, 241,200. You can feel how it sits somewhere between human memory and geological time. It's too long for oral tradition alone, too short to be pure fantasy like eternity. It belongs to a strange middle ground, where myths and very old events might still echo each other. Perhaps the scribes who calculated it were trying, in their own language, to express a sense that many cycles had passed before their own beginning, cycles of stars, of earth, of human rise and fall. In that view, the 8 pre-flood kings become like 8 ages of humanity. Maybe each one marks a civilization that bloomed and then faded, leaving behind only fragments, a pattern of building, a style of temple, a way of reading the sky. Some of those fragments may have drifted down through floods and migrations to the Ubaid and Sumerian world. By the time our scribes pick up their stylus, the details are gone, but the outline remains. There were worlds before ours, many of them. Another possibility sits nearby like a quiet neighbor. The number might encode something more cosmic than human, a memory of how the heavens move. Over very long spans, Earth's axis slowly wobbles. The points where seasons meet the stars shift. If some ancient observers noticed traces of this precession, they might have folded that discovery into sacred time. 200 years could, in their mind, be a way of marking several great years of the world, eras when the sky's backdrop and the tone of life felt different. The truth, of course, is that we don't know exactly what they meant. The clay doesn't come with a footnote explaining the logic. What we have is the number itself, standing there like a dark mountain in the middle of the text, and the clear feeling that the Sumerians took it seriously. They didn't joke about the pre-flood kings, they didn't wink. They listed those reigns with the same calm they used for later, verifiable rulers, then drew a line of water and moved on. As you breathe gently, you can treat that number the way we treated the flood, the Apkallu, the drowned plains. Not as a puzzle to solve completely tonight, but as a doorway. 241,200 years becomes a symbol of everything we sense, but cannot quite trace. Cycles of the sky, forgotten cultures, ages of human experiment that ended in mud and silence. The Sumerians pressed it into clay as if to say, our story is not the first, we are just the latest page. In that sense, the mystery of 241,000 years is less about the exact count and more about the humility it implies. The Sumerians, standing at what we call the dawn of civilization, were already looking backward into a darkness full of unseen worlds. They felt in their bones that time was deep and that humanity had been here before in ways they could barely remember. The number is their way of nodding toward that depth, a long, thoughtful pause carved into wet clay. In the next chapter, we follow that feeling outward, from one mysterious sum of years to the wider idea it supports, that history does not march in a straight line, but moves in loops. Civilizations rise, shine, and fall. The flood is one reset. Others may lie behind or ahead. For now, let the number drift through your thoughts like a very slow comet, circling and recircling, reminding us that our moment, like every moment, sits inside patterns larger than we can see. Chapter 19, The Cyclical Nature of History. Think of a shoreline for a moment. Waves roll in, break, and pull back. From far above, it might look as if nothing changes. Zoom in, and you see the truth. Sand moved, shells tumbled, lines drawn and erased over and over. Human history, the Sumerians might say, works much the same way. Civilizations are like waves. They rise, crest, and collapse. Over time, the patterns start to look familiar. In the Sumerian world, the flood was the great turning point, the moment when one long era ended and a smaller, sharper one began. But if we step back and look at the broader record of earth and myth, that flood begins to look like one of many resets. Ice ages advance and retreat. Forests spread, then shrink. Seas rise, then fall. Sometimes the changes are slow. Sometimes they come in sharp jolts. Volcanic winters, comet impacts, sudden shifts of climate that squeeze human communities into narrow, harsh corridors. Each time people adapt as best they can. Some groups vanish entirely, leaving only a few stone tools or a scattering of bones. Others move, learn new skills, invent new stories. A kind of cultural amnesia sets in. You focus on the urgent present, on surviving. Yet small fragments of what came before slip through, in myths of golden ages, lost islands, cities drowned by the sea, gods who used to walk among men, but no longer do. The Sumerians gathered some of those fragments into their king lists and tales. Other cultures did the same, each in their own language. You can imagine history as a spiral staircase instead of a straight ramp. We pass similar points again and again: discovery, growth, arrogance, overreach, collapse, but each time at a different height, with different tools. The Sumerians, looking back on their before and their flood, might have sensed that they were not the first to climb, nor would they be the last to fall. Their insistence on cycles, in timekeeping, in kingship, in myth, reflects that intuition. The universe to them didn't just allow repetition, it ran on it. The flood then becomes a symbol of what happens when a wave grows too tall. It's not only punishment for moral failure, though stories often frame it that way. It's also a natural correction. Systems overload. Populations press against fragile environments. Water, fire, or shifting earth reassert limits. Afterward, survivors look around at the broken pieces and have to decide what to rebuild and what to leave behind from the world that just ended. Modern eyes, reading the clay and the rocks, start to see similar patterns. There were extinctions long before humans, when oceans turned sour or asteroids hit. There were regional collapses of human cultures too. Cities abandoned in Mesopotamia, in the Indus Valley, in the Americas. Droughts, invasions, internal decay. Each fall leaves room for something new to grow. Each new growth carries deep in its bones the lessons and sometimes the mistakes of the last attempt. The Sumerian sense of cyclical history is not hopeless, though. It's sober. They built temples and cities, knowing that others had crumbled before. They wrote laws and myths, tracked stars and floods, perhaps in part to avoid repeating certain disasters, or at least to pass on advice to whoever came after them. We were here, their tablets say. This is what we learned before the waters rose, or the enemies came, or the gods turned their faces away. As you breathe slowly, you might imagine our own world as just another city in that long series, bright, loud, convinced of its uniqueness, and yet subject to the same deep rhythms, environmental limits, human pride, unexpected change. It's a humbling thought, but also strangely comforting. If history is cyclical, then collapse is not the end of the story. It is a chapter. The page turns. Something new tries again. For the Sumerians, that something new was their own civilization, rising out of marshes and drowned memories. For us, the cycle may look different. New technologies, new challenges, new ways of forgetting and remembering. But beneath the surface, the pattern remains. Rise, flourish, strain, break, reset. The flood is one name for the breaking point. There are others. Tonight you don't need to solve all of this. You can simply rest with the image of history as a series of waves on a very old shore. Some waves carry Eridu and others carry Babylon, Nineveh, Athens, Rome. Others carry cities whose names we don't yet know because they have not been built or because they were and are now dust. Between each crest and crash, there is a quiet moment, like the pause between breaths where the sea gathers itself to rise again. Let your own breath find that rhythm, in and out. The Sumerians wrote of kings before the flood and kings after, of long ages and sudden resets, of worlds ending and beginning. Their story, in the end, is less about one civilization and more about the great patient habit of the universe, to try, to change, to fall, and to start again. Chapter 20, The Final Echo. Take one more slow breath, in and out. We've walked a long way together, through floods and forgotten plains, up temple steps, and down into the Abzu, across clay tablets and quiet museum shelves. Now, at the edge of this story, it's time to turn and look not just backward, but gently, honestly, at where we are, at our own place in the pattern. If the Sumerians were right, if time moves in great circles, if civilizations rise and fall like waves, then ours is not the first bright city shining on the dark sea of time. It is simply the one we're standing inside. We have glass towers instead of mud brick walls, fiber optics instead of clay tablets, rockets instead of reed boats. But the feeling underneath is strangely familiar. We build, we measure, we argue, we watch the sky, we worry about the future. Tonight, somewhere, a satellite orbits above Earth, quietly tracking the movements of Venus, Mars, and distant stars. Far below, a child looks up from a crowded city street, catches a glimpse of the same moon that Sumerian priests watched from their temple roofs. In another place, a scientist studies climate records and sea levels, tracing patterns of warming and rising water. Without knowing it, she is following the same questions that haunted the people of Shuruppak. How high can the waters go? Will we be ready if they rise again? Our world moves faster, louder. We store our memories in clouds, not the ones that bring rain, but servers humming in cold rooms, full of data flickering in and out. Yet the problem is the same one the Sumerians faced. What will survive when our towers crack and our screens go dark? What will someone, thousands of years from now, be able to hold in their hand and say, "This is what they were like"? Maybe it will be our own kind of clay. Glass turned to shards in some buried dump, a metal plate etched with symbols sent on a probe into deep space, a few carved stones, forgotten time capsules, or scratched names on concrete. Or maybe it will be stories, fragments of myths, songs, and quiet prayers that slip past empires and carry some small piece of us forward. The Sumerians thought they were preserving their world for their children. They ended up speaking to us. We are likely doing the same, without realizing it. The video that began this journey suggested something bold, that the echo of the first civilization still lives in three places: in the clay, in the stars, and inside us. In the clay, because those old tablets show we have been clever and frightened and hopeful for a very long time. In the stars, because the sky still carries the patterns ancient eyes traced, the constellations and cycles that guided their kings and farmers. And inside us, because certain ideas keep returning no matter how many ages pass. The longing for meaning, the fear of losing everything, the belief that we are part of something bigger than our own brief years. If you listen closely, you can hear those echoes in everyday moments. When someone writes a poem about the night sky, when a programmer designs an elegant bit of code, not so different in spirit from a scribe arranging signs in base 60, when a city planner tries to align a park with sunrise, even if he doesn't know he's repeating an old temple trick. When a storyteller, maybe one like you, sits down to retell an ancient myth in new words so it won't be forgotten, the past is not gone, it is woven into our habits. Our civilization, for all its speed and power, is fragile too. We worry about climate and conflict, about technologies we barely control, about the weight we place on the planet. The Sumerians might recognize that worry. They lived with the memory of waters that went too far, winds that blew too hard, gods or forces that reset the board. If they could speak to us from their clay, maybe they would say something simple. Remember, learn from what we wrote. You're not the first wave. Try to break a little more gently. And yet, even if we don't, even if we repeat some of their mistakes, the story does not end in despair. History's cycles are harsh, but they are also generous. After every collapse, someone survives. Someone carries seeds, tools, songs. Someone rebuilds a hearth, a village, a city. The first civilization is never truly first. It stands on shoulders we can't see. The last civilization is never truly last. It leaves traces for someone else to find. So as this chapter closes, you can hold one thought very softly. Nothing you are, nothing we are as a species came from nowhere. We are heirs of Sumer, of Ubaid, of forgotten peoples whose names crumbled long before their ideas did. The way we count time, draw circles, watch the sky, write laws, tell bedtime stories, all of it is threaded with echoes from ages that thought they were the beginning. Let your shoulders relax one more time. Feel the weight of your body sink into the bed. Above you, whether you can see it or not, the same stars keep turning their slow, patient circles. Somewhere, in a museum drawer, a Sumerian tablet lies in the dark, its wedges still sharp. Somewhere else, a new story is being written on paper or on a screen, joining that long chain of memory. The first civilization is not as far away as it seems. It speaks in the ticking of our clocks, in the minutes and seconds of base 60. It glows in the constellations we still name. It murmurs through the lessons we keep relearning, about pride, about water, about how precious and fragile cities really are. The past was not destroyed. It was only covered layer by layer, like a temple rebuilt over older walls. And if you listen here in the quiet, you can almost hear it, a soft echo from deep time, from clay to clay, from star to star, from mind to mind. Rest now, you are part of that echo. And the story, whatever comes next, is still being written,